The first thing Victor Hale buried was not the box. It was the truth, and Atlas smelled it before anyone else had the courage to look down. The mansion stood above the North Carolina coast like something polished for a magazine, white columns glowing under strings of garden lights. Glass doors opened to music, laughter, and the clean clink of expensive silverware. Beyond the terrace, the Atlantic wind moved through trimmed hedges and rows of white flowers planted too perfectly around an old oak tree. Staff Sergeant Caleb Rowe stood near the edge of the crowd in a simple field uniform, his white face calm beneath the soft gold light, one hand resting loosely on the lead of his German Shepherd K9. Atlas sat at his left side, black and tan coat brushed smooth, amber eyes alert but quiet, his working collar clean except for the worn tag that clicked whenever he shifted. They had been invited for a Rescue Foundation fundraiser, the kind of evening where wealthy donors smiled beside banners, promised generous checks, and posed for photographs with dogs they would never have to bathe, train, or carry through the rain. Caleb did not belong in that world, and he knew it. His boots looked too practical against the polished stone. His uniform held too many honest creases. Atlas, however, seemed untouched by the judgment around him. He watched the garden, not the guests. Victor Hale noticed. The host of the evening was tall, silver-haired, and perfectly dressed in a navy suit that looked made to stand under chandeliers. He had the kind of smile that arrived before warmth did. Cameras loved him. Reporters called him a champion for abandoned animals. His name was painted across shelter vans, veterinary grants, and adoption drives across 3 counties. But when he walked toward Caleb, the smile changed at the edges. It became smaller, sharper. "So this is the famous rescue dog," Victor said, loud enough for nearby guests to turn. "A charity dog with a badge." A few people laughed politely, not because it was funny, but because money had spoken and they were trained to answer. Caleb did not move. He felt Atlas's lead slack in his hand, felt the dog breathe once, slow and steady. Victor tilted his head, looking down at Atlas as if inspecting a stain on the floor. "Amazing what a uniform can do," he added. "Put a collar on a broken animal, and everyone calls it noble." The laughter faded faster this time. Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed quiet. "Atlas works search and rescue." Victor smiled toward the guests. "Of course. Very inspiring." Then he looked back at Caleb. "Just keep him away from the flower beds. Those cost more than most people's cars." That was when Atlas stood. Not with anger, not with embarrassment, with purpose. His head turned toward the garden behind Victor, toward the old oak tree where the soil beneath the white flowers looked darker than the rest, as if it had been watered too recently or disturbed too late at night. Caleb felt the change travel through the lead before he saw it in the dog's body. Atlas took one step, then another. Caleb followed, his eyes narrowing. The music behind them kept playing, but conversations began to thin. Victor's smile vanished. "Sergeant," he said, his voice low now, "control your dog." Atlas reached the edge of the flower bed and stopped with his nose inches above the soil. He inhaled once, then lifted his eyes to Caleb. It was not curiosity. It was recognition. A cold thread moved through Caleb's chest. "Atlas," he whispered, "what did you find?" The German shepherd lowered one paw into the soft earth and began to scrape. Caleb knew the sound of judgment when it dressed itself as laughter. He had heard it in waiting rooms, at county meetings, outside shelters where people donated old towels but looked away from old dogs. That was why he had come to Victor Hale's mansion in the first place, not for the music or the photographs or the careful speeches beneath warm garden lights, but because the Coastal Rescue Center needed money for kennels, medical care, and one more chance for animals that had already been failed by too many hands. Atlas had once been one of them. 3 years earlier, before the K9 vest, before the search certifications, before Marines trusted his nose in storms and rubble and woods gone black with night, Atlas had been found outside an abandoned training property 20 miles inland. No papers, no owner, no clean history, just a young German shepherd with mud in his coat, a deep collar mark hidden beneath his fur, and a habit of flinching whenever a metal gate slammed too hard. Caleb remembered the first day clearly. Atlas had not barked. He had stood at the far end of a kennel run, eyes bright, body still, watching every person like he was trying to decide whether the world deserved another chance. Other people saw a problem dog. Caleb saw a soldier without a unit. It took weeks before Atlas accepted food from his hand. Months before he slept without waking at every hinge, latch, and chain. But once trust found him, it changed everything. He learned scent work like it was a language he had been born speaking. He found lost hikers, missing children, elderly neighbors who had wandered from home, and once, an injured deputy hidden in marsh grass after a hurricane evacuation. He never worked for applause. He worked because somewhere ahead, someone needed him. And now, beneath Victor Hale's oak tree, that same dog was scraping at the soft earth while the richest man in 3 counties pretended nothing was wrong. Caleb stepped closer, keeping his voice calm. Atlas, easy. The dog paused, but he did not leave the spot. His nose hovered above the soil, nostrils moving, ears forward, body focused with the same solemn certainty Caleb had seen in real searches. This was not misbehavior. This was alert. Behind them, the fundraiser had begun to rearrange itself around silence. A woman in a cream dress lowered her champagne glass. A photographer let his camera hang idle against his chest. Someone whispered, "Is he trained to do that?" Caleb did not answer. Victor did. He is trained to ruin landscaping, apparently. His voice was light, but his hand had tightened around the stem of his glass. Caleb noticed. Atlas noticed more. The old oak's branches shifted in the ocean wind, and the scent of wet soil rose from the flower bed, sharp and fresh, not like ground that had been settled for weeks. Caleb saw the difference now. The white flowers near the trunk were newly planted, their roots too neat, their soil too dark compared to the rest of the garden. A thin strip of blue nylon showed between 2 clumps of earth, almost hidden under a petal. Caleb crouched and brushed aside the topsoil with 2 fingers. Victor moved fast enough that several guests turned. "Do not touch that." The words came out too hard, too bare. Caleb looked up slowly. Victor's polished smile tried to return, but it no longer fit his face. "This is private property, Sergeant." Caleb stood, one hand still on Atlas's lead, the other open at his side. "Then you should have no trouble explaining why my rescue dog just alerted on freshly turned soil at a rescue fundraiser." The garden went quiet enough to hear Atlas breathing. Victor Hale had built his public life on perfect pictures. Caleb saw them everywhere as the silence spread across the garden, framed along the terrace wall, printed on glossy brochures near the donation table, looping on the large screen beside the fountain. Victor kneeling beside a golden retriever with a red ribbon around its neck. Victor opening a new kennel wing with oversized scissors. Victor smiling in front of shelter vans painted with his family name. Every image looked warm from a distance, but up close it felt staged, too clean, too arranged, too empty of the dirt and patience real rescue work required. Caleb had known enough good shelters to recognize the difference. Real compassion smelled like disinfectant, wet blankets, tired coffee, and people staying late because one frightened dog would not eat unless someone sat beside the bowl. Victor's mansion smelled like expensive candles and watered flowers. Atlas remained beside the old oak, one paw planted near the exposed strip of blue nylon, eyes locked on the soil. The guests had formed a loose circle now, careful not to stand too close, careful not to miss what might happen next. Victor lifted both hands as if calming a room he still believed belonged to him. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this interruption," he said, turning the polished voice back on. "Some animals carry difficult histories. They react to all kinds of things. Fertilizer, other dogs, a nervous handler." Caleb did not rise to it. That irritated Victor more than any argument could have. A woman near the fountain spoke quietly. "Is the dog trained for detection?" Caleb nodded once, eyes still on Atlas. "Search and rescue, scent discrimination, human remains recovery support when requested, and evidence location support under law enforcement supervision." The words settled heavier than Victor expected. His jaw shifted. "This is absurd. We are at a fundraiser, not a crime scene." From the edge of the terrace came a small voice, thin but steady. "Then why did you have the garden crew here after midnight?" Everyone turned. An older woman stood near the service entrance, wearing a black house staff uniform and holding a tray she had forgotten to set down. Her silver hair was pinned tightly at the back of her head, and her hands trembled just enough to make the glasses touch. Caleb had noticed her earlier refilling water bowls for the demonstration dogs while the guests barely looked at her. Victor's face changed in a way only Caleb seemed to catch. Not fear. Calculation. Ruth, Victor said gently, too gently. This is not your concern. Ruth swallowed. The ocean wind lifted the napkins on a nearby table. You told them to dig after the veterinarian left angry. Victor's smile vanished altogether. Go inside. Ruth did not move. Atlas lowered his nose again and gave one quiet huff into the soil. Caleb saw it then, another edge beneath the dirt, not nylon this time, but metal, dark and dull under the flower roots. He lifted his phone and called the number printed on the Rescue Foundation badge clipped to his uniform. This is Staff Sergeant Caleb Rowe. I need the Foundation director at the rear garden now, and I need local law enforcement to respond for a possible evidence recovery on private property. Victor stepped closer, his voice dropped. You are making a mistake. Caleb looked at him, calm as stone. No, sir. Atlas already found one. A murmur moved through the crowd. The music had stopped without anyone noticing. Atlas stood over the disturbed soil, wet earth on his paw, silent and immovable. For the first time that evening, the mansion no longer looked like power. It looked like a stage after the lights had exposed the floorboards. The first patrol car arrived without sirens, its lights washing blue and red across the white flowers, the oak trunk, and the faces of people who had come expecting champagne and praise. By then the Foundation director, Marlene Brooks, had reached the garden with 2 staff members and a look of disbelief she was trying hard to control. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with reading glasses hanging from a chain and the kind of tired eyes that came from loving unwanted animals longer than most people could bear. She stood beside Caleb, looked at Atlas, then looked at the disturbed soil. Tell me exactly what happened, she said. Caleb kept his voice steady. Atlas alerted to this area. I found blue nylon and what appears to be a metal container beneath the soil. Mrs. Ruth said the garden was disturbed after a veterinarian left upset. Ruth stood a few feet away now, hands folded tightly in front of her, her face pale under the terrace lights. Victor had moved closer to the guests again, trying to reclaim the evening by standing where everyone could see him. This is theater, he said. A misunderstanding inflated by a man who brought an unstable rescue animal to a private event. Atlas did not even look at him. That silence made Victor sound smaller. A county deputy approached the flower bed and spoke with Caleb first, then Marlene, then Ruth. He did not touch the soil until permission and documentation were handled. Phones were lowered. Conversations became whispers. The photographer, who had been paid to capture smiling donors, now stood frozen with his lens pointed at the ground. Caleb knelt beside Atlas, not to restrain him, but to reassure him. You did your part, he murmured. Atlas sat, though his eyes stayed on the spot near the oak. The deputy and a second officer carefully moved the top layer of soil with small tools from a garden shed, slow and respectful, as if the earth itself had become a witness. The blue nylon came free first, a cut length of old lead line stiff with dirt. Then the corner of a metal box appeared, dark green, waterproof, the kind used for documents on boats or job sites. Victor laughed once, too sharply. A utility box. Congratulations. You found landscaping supplies. No one laughed with him. The deputy lifted the box from the ground and set it on a plastic evidence sheet. Mud clung to the hinges. The latch was sealed with tape that had browned at the edges. Marlene pressed one hand to her chest. That is not ours, she whispered. Ruth's voice came from behind them. He carried it himself. Victor turned on her. Enough. The word cracked through the garden. Ruth flinched, but she did not step back. Caleb rose slowly, placing himself between the old woman and Victor without making a show of it. Let her speak, he said. Victor's eyes flashed. You are a guest here. Caleb's face remained calm. Then stop giving me reasons to stay. The deputy opened the box with gloved hands. Inside were sealed folders, several old collars, microchip tags and small plastic sleeves, and veterinary records with names crossed out and replaced. The garden seemed to lose its air. Marlene bent closer, her mouth tightening as she recognized shelter codes printed on some of the labels. These are intake records, she said softly. Some of these dogs were listed as transferred. Caleb looked down. Near the bottom of the box, caught beneath a cracked leather collar, was a rusted tag shaped like a small shield. Mud had hidden most of the letters, but one line remained visible under the flashlight. Atlas. For 1 second, the ocean wind, the guests, the mansion, and Victor Hale all seemed to fall away. Caleb forgot the crowd. He forgot the cameras. He saw only the dog beside him, the same German shepherd who had arrived years ago with no history and a collar mark no one could explain. Atlas leaned forward and sniffed the tag, then went very still. Caleb felt something inside his chest tighten, not with anger, but with recognition so deep it hurt. Victor had not buried supplies. He had buried names. Caleb did not touch the tag at first. He only looked at it, half buried in the open box among old collars, altered records, and little plastic sleeves holding microchip numbers that should have belonged to living histories, not hidden evidence. The shield-shaped tag was rusted at the edges, its chain broken, its stamped letters worn by dirt and time. Atlas. The name sat there like a voice coming up from underground. Beside Caleb, the German shepherd lowered his head and breathed over it once, slowly, as if scent could unlock a door memory had kept closed. His ears shifted back for a moment, not in fear exactly, but in something Caleb recognized from the early days at the kennel, that distant stillness Atlas carried whenever a metal latch clicked too sharply or a stranger moved too fast near his collar. Caleb reached down and rested his hand lightly between the dog's shoulders. "Easy," he whispered. "I am here." Victor's voice cut across the garden, polished again, but thinner now. "This is ridiculous. That tag could belong to any dog. Atlas is not exactly a rare name." Marlene Brooks turned toward him with a folder in her gloved hands, her expression no longer confused but wounded. "Then why are these records from shelters your foundation funded?" Victor spread his hands. "Administrative files get misplaced. Old collars are disposed of. You people are letting sentiment turn clutter into scandal." Caleb stood slowly. He did not raise his voice. "Sentiment did not bury a waterproof box behind your mansion. The guests heard it. So did the deputy taking notes near the flower bed. So did Ruth, who stood with tears bright in her eyes and her chin lifted for the first time that evening. The deputy photographed each item before anything was removed. One by one, the truth came into the light. Intake forms with dog names changed. Transfer sheets missing signatures. Veterinary notes showing conditions that had been softened into harmless language. Microchip tags separated from the animals they once identified. Nothing graphic. Nothing loud. Just the quiet, deliberate erasure of lives that had depended on people to tell the truth for them. Marlene's hands trembled as she read. These dogs were marked as placed with partner programs. Ruth's voice shook but held. Some never left the property records. When Dr. Ellison asked questions, Mr. Hale said donors do not like complicated stories. Victor turned sharply. "You signed confidentiality paperwork." Ruth looked at him, smaller than he was, poorer than he was, and suddenly braver than everyone who had laughed at his jokes. "I did not sign away my conscience." The words moved through the crowd like a bell. Caleb felt Atlas shift beside him. The dog was still staring at the old tag. Caleb crouched again, waiting until the deputy nodded permission for him to look without removing it. He angled his flashlight closer. Beneath the name was a partial number, 3 digits still visible through the rust. Caleb knew that number. It matched the faded imprint on Atlas's current microchip file, the one the rescue center had always called incomplete, the one that had stopped every search into his past. Caleb's throat tightened. This was not just a name. This was a beginning. The deputy sealed the tag in a small clear bag and held it up long enough for the camera to capture the letters. Atlas watched the bag as it rose, his body silent, his eyes bright under the garden lights. Caleb wanted anger to come. It would have been easier, cleaner. But what came instead was grief, deep and quiet. For every animal turned into a photo opportunity, for every record changed because truth looked inconvenient, for every rescued soul treated as a prop until it became difficult to explain. Victor tried one more time. "Sergeant, think carefully. Accusations like this can ruin reputations." Caleb looked at the mansion, the white columns, the perfect flowers, the donors no longer smiling, and then at Atlas, who had found his own name beneath the soil. "No, Mr. Hale," Caleb said. "Truth does not ruin a reputation. It reveals what built it." Victor had no answer. The ocean wind moved through the garden, lifting the scent of fresh earth around them. Atlas sat beside Caleb, not triumphant, not restless, only steady, as if he had not come there to shame a man, but to bring home what had been taken from the light. The garden did not erupt. That was what Caleb remembered most. There was no dramatic shouting, no sudden rush, no great collapse of stone and money. Justice, when it finally entered Victor Hale's perfect mansion, came quietly, carried in evidence bags, witness statements, and the steady breathing of a rescue dog beside an old oak tree. The deputies continued their work under the garden lights while Marlene Brooks stood with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking to the foundation board in a voice that had lost every trace of politeness. Donors who had spent the evening practicing smiles now stood in uneasy clusters, reading the same names on the recovered records, realizing their money had been used to polish a story instead of protect the lives behind it. Victor remained near the terrace steps, still straight-backed, still expensive, but the room he had owned only an hour before no longer answered to him. Every attempt he made to explain sounded smaller than the box in the deputy's hands. Ruth was seated now beside the fountain with a blanket around her shoulders, not because the night was cold, but because telling the truth after years of carrying it can make the body shake. Caleb brought her a glass of water. She took it with both hands. "I should have spoken sooner," she said. Caleb looked toward Atlas, who sat near the flower bed, gaze fixed on the sealed bag holding the rusted tag. "Sometimes fear teaches people to wait," Caleb said. Ruth's eyes filled. "And sometimes a dog gets tired of waiting for us." Caleb gave a faint nod. "Yes, ma'am." Across the garden, Marlene ended her call and walked toward Victor. She did not raise her voice. That made the moment stronger. "Effective immediately, our rescue center is suspending all financial ties with your foundation pending the investigation." Victor stared at her as if she had forgotten who he was. "You cannot survive without my support." Marlene looked at the old collars being cataloged on the evidence sheet, then at Atlas, then at Caleb. "If support comes with buried records, we were never surviving. We were being used." A few donors shifted uncomfortably. One man in a gray suit stepped forward and spoke to Marlene, quiet but clear enough for those near him to hear. "My company will redirect our annual donation to your center directly." A woman beside him nodded. "Mine too." Then another. Not loud, not theatrical, just one decision after another, small stones changing the course of a river. Victor's face tightened, but he said nothing. Money was still in the garden, but for once it was not moving toward him. Caleb felt Atlas stand before he turned to see it. The German shepherd took 3 slow steps toward the evidence table, then stopped beside the sealed tag. The deputy glanced at Caleb. "He seems attached to that one." Caleb's voice was quiet. It was attached to him first. The deputy looked at the paperwork in his hand, then softened. "We will process it properly. If it matches, you will be notified." Caleb nodded, though part of him wanted to hold the tag right then, to place it against Atlas's collar and close the wound with a simple click of metal. But truth had its own route home. It needed patience. It needed order. It needed to be protected better than it had been buried. Victor passed near Caleb on his way inside, escorted by his attorney now, his voice low enough that only Caleb could hear. "You think this makes you righteous?" Caleb turned his head slowly. He saw the mansion lights behind Victor, the perfect windows, the polished stone, all of it suddenly fragile under the weight of one dog's nose. "No," Caleb said. "It makes him right." Victor's eyes flicked to Atlas and away again. He walked inside without another word. Later, as the last guests left and the garden returned to the hush of wind and ocean, Ruth approached Atlas with careful steps. She bent down, her hand trembling in the air. "May I?" Caleb gave Atlas the smallest signal. The dog stepped forward and lowered his head. Ruth touched the fur between his ears and closed her eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered. Atlas leaned into her palm, not forgiving because he understood paperwork or power, but because some souls answer sorrow with gentleness before people know how to ask for it. Caleb watched the old woman cry silently over the dog once hidden by the very house that had smiled in his name. Above them, the oak leaves moved in the coastal wind. Beneath them, the disturbed soil lay open, no longer a grave for secrets, but a beginning. 2 weeks later, the mansion no longer glowed at night. The strings of garden lights had been taken down, the banners removed, and the donation tables carried away, leaving pale rectangles on the stone terrace where polished promises had once stood. News vans had come and gone. Board members had resigned. The Rescue Foundation had opened its records to investigators, and every shelter linked to Victor Hale's name was being reviewed with the careful patience truth deserves. Caleb did not follow every headline. He read only what Marlene sent him, and even then, he read slowly, because each recovered file felt less like paperwork and more like a name being spoken after too long in the dark. At the K-9 unit near Camp Lejeune, life continued in ordinary rhythms. Dawn runs, scent drills, kennel checks, coffee cooling on metal desks. Atlas worked with the same quiet focus he always had, but Caleb noticed small changes now. The dog no longer lowered his ears when a metal latch snapped shut. He still turned his head toward the sound, but he did not retreat inside himself the way he once had. It was as if finding the buried tag had not hurt him further, but returned a missing piece to a place he had always been guarding. On a gray Thursday morning, the call came from the county office. The recovered tag and partial microchip records matched Atlas. Not just likely, confirmed. Caleb stood in the hallway outside the training room with the phone pressed to his ear, watching Atlas sit patiently beside a row of orange cones while a young handler reset the course. The officer explained that the old records had listed Atlas under a transfer program that never properly existed. One of several dogs moved through Victor's network for donor reports, and then erased when their histories became inconvenient. Caleb listened without speaking. He thought of the first day at the rescue kennel, Atlas standing far away, refusing to trust the bowl in his hand. He thought of the collar mark hidden under black and tan fur. He thought of Victor calling him broken. The word felt smaller now, almost foolish. Atlas had never been broken. He had been interrupted. Caleb thanked the officer and hung up. For a moment, he stayed where he was, hearing the distant shuffle of boots, the scrape of a chair, the faint bark of another dog outside. Then Atlas looked over at him. He must have sensed the change, because he left the cones and walked straight to Caleb, head tilted, eyes steady. Caleb knelt in the hallway. "It is yours," he said softly. "The tag, the name, all of it." Atlas pressed his forehead against Caleb's chest, a rare gesture, brief and heavy with trust. Caleb closed one hand around the working collar and let himself breathe. That afternoon, Marlene arrived with Ruth. The old housekeeper looked different away from the mansion, smaller in the plain daylight, but freer, as if the ocean wind had finally let go of her shoulders. She carried a folder of copied records and a small envelope sealed by the county evidence office. Inside was the rusted tag, cleaned only enough for the letters to show, still worn, still scarred, but no longer hidden. Caleb signed the release forms at the K-9 office desk. Ruth watched Atlas from the doorway, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. "I used to see him in the old intake yard," she said. Caleb looked up. Ruth's eyes shone, but her voice held. "He was younger, always watching the gate. I did not know what happened to him after the records changed." Caleb opened the envelope and looked at the tag resting inside. "Now you do." Ruth nodded, tears slipping down without shame. Caleb clipped the old tag onto a short display chain, then held it near Atlas's collar without attaching it yet. The new tag on Atlas's working collar was clean, official, earned through years of service. The old one was rusty, wounded by silence, but it carried the first proof that he had existed before anyone decided his story was inconvenient. Caleb did not replace one with the other. He held both in his hand for a long moment. "You are not either one," he whispered to Atlas. "You are all of it." Atlas lifted his nose and touched the old tag once. The metal clicked softly against Caleb's palm. Marlene wiped her glasses and looked away. Outside, Marines crossed the yard under a sky beginning to clear. Somewhere beyond the fence, dogs barked in the kennel row, alive and impatient for the next meal, the next walk, the next chance. Caleb placed the old tag in a small frame beside Atlas's certification photo, not as evidence anymore, but as witness. Ruth stepped closer and read the name through the glass. "He found himself," she said. Caleb rested his hand on Atlas's head. "No, ma'am," he answered. "He was never lost. People just stopped looking." The first adoption event after the investigation was not held at a mansion. It was held on the training yard at the K-9 unit, beneath a row of canvas tents that snapped gently in the coastal wind. There were no chandeliers, no marble steps, no photographers asking anyone to angle their smile toward the light. There were folding tables, water bowls, clipboards, leashes hanging from hooks, and volunteers in plain shirts moving with the kind of purpose that does not need applause. Caleb stood near the entrance with Atlas at his side, watching families walk slowly from kennel to kennel, kneeling when they met a dog, asking careful questions, listening to the answers. That was what felt different. People were listening. Marlene Brooks had rebuilt the event from the ground up after the foundation severed ties with Victor Hale. Every donation went directly through the rescue center. Every dog had a complete file. Every medical record was printed, reviewed, and placed where adopters could read it without asking permission from anyone powerful. Ruth sat at a registration table in the shade, wearing a volunteer badge and a soft blue sweater instead of a staff uniform. She checked names, handed out forms, and smiled every time a dog walked past her with its tail high. The old fear had not vanished from her face entirely, but it had loosened. Grace often begins that way, not as a shout, but as one less weight on the shoulders. Atlas watched the yard with quiet dignity. His current working tag rested on his collar. His old rusted tag remained framed inside the K9 office, visible through the window behind Caleb's desk. Caleb had decided not to make it a display of pain. It was a witness, nothing more. A reminder that records could be restored, names could be spoken again, and a life once used for a false story could still become true in the hands of mercy. Near the far tent, a senior hound with a gray muzzle sat beside a teenage girl in a wheelchair, resting its chin gently on her knee as if it had been waiting all morning for exactly her. By the water station, a young couple laughed softly when a shy terrier finally accepted a treat. Under the largest tent, a black shepherd mix with one cloudy eye leaned against a retired teacher who had come only to look and was now crying into the dog's neck. Caleb saw Marlene watching the scene with both hands clasped over her clipboard. "This is what it should have been," she said when she came beside him. Caleb nodded. "No performance." Marlene looked at Atlas. "Just proof." A county officer arrived near noon and spoke with Marlene quietly. Caleb caught only pieces. More records recovered. Additional shelters cooperating. Several dogs located in partner homes, alive and safe. No dramatic announcement followed. No one stopped the music playing softly from a portable speaker. But Marlene's face changed, and Caleb knew another small door had opened. Ruth looked over from the registration table. Marlene gave her a nod. Ruth covered her mouth with one hand, then went back to helping the next family sign in. Atlas suddenly stood. Caleb followed his gaze across the yard to a boy of about 10 standing near the fence, hesitant, hands buried in the pockets of his hoodie. Beside him was a nervous tan dog with a rescue bandana, refusing to take one more step toward the crowd. The boy looked embarrassed. The dog looked overwhelmed. Atlas took one calm step, then another, stopping several feet away, lowering his head without rushing. The tan dog stared at him, trembling slightly, then sniffed the air. Caleb stayed still. So did the boy. After a long moment, the nervous dog stepped forward and touched noses with Atlas. The boy smiled as if a locked gate had opened. "He never does that," he whispered. Caleb's voice was gentle. "Sometimes they just need someone steady to go first." The boy nodded, then looked at Atlas with open wonder. Was he scared once? Caleb glanced toward the office window where the old tag waited in its frame. "Yes," he said, "but scared is not the end of a story." The boy looked down at the tan dog, then slowly offered his hand. This time, the dog leaned closer. Caleb felt Atlas settle beside him again. The work done without command, without crowd, without praise. Across the yard, another adoption form was signed. A leash changed hands. A dog followed a new family into the sunlight. And the place where Victor Hale once bought admiration with polished lies was replaced by something quieter, poorer, cleaner, and infinitely stronger. Truth with muddy paws. By sunset, the adoption yard had grown quiet, but it did not feel empty. It felt blessed by every footstep that had crossed it. The tents came down slowly, their canvas folding into soft white bundles. Volunteers gathered water bowls, swept loose fur from the pavement, and stacked empty crates beside the fence. The last family left with the senior hound walking carefully between them, its gray muzzle lifted toward the evening air as if it already knew the way home. Caleb stood near the K9 office with Atlas beside him, watching the gate close behind them. The sky over Camp Lejeune had turned the color of warm brass. and the coastal wind carried the scent of grass, dog biscuits, and rain waiting somewhere beyond the trees. Ruth approached with a small folder held against her chest. "Final count," she said, her voice tired but light. 7 adoptions today, 3 foster placements, and enough direct donations to cover medical care for the next intake group. Marlene Brooks joined them, wiping her glasses with the edge of her shirt. "No mansion needed," she said. Caleb looked across the yard where muddy paw prints marked the concrete in every direction. "Looks better this way." Ruth smiled, then glanced toward the office window where Atlas's old tag sat in its small frame beside his certification photo. "I used to think truth had to be loud to matter," she said. "Tonight, it sounds like dogs going home." No one answered right away, because some sentences deserve room to settle. Atlas rose and walked to the office door. Caleb opened it, and the German shepherd stepped inside with the quiet confidence of an animal who no longer needed to search for his place in the world. Caleb followed him to the desk. The frame tag caught the last light through the window, the rusted letters softened but still readable. Atlas. Beneath it, Caleb had placed a newer photograph from that afternoon. Atlas touching noses with the nervous tan dog while the boy in the hoodie watched with wonder. Old name. New Mercy. Same soul. Caleb rested one hand on the frame and one hand on Atlas's head. For a moment he thought about Victor Hale's garden, the white flowers, the buried box, the laughter that had tried to make dignity look small. Then he thought of the yard outside, the families, the records made honest, Ruth sitting in sunlight, Marlene signing adoption papers, and dogs stepping into futures no one would need to hide. The difference was not money. It was care. It was the humble decision to tell the truth even when the truth arrived with mud on its paws. Atlas leaned against Caleb's leg, heavy and warm. "You brought your name home," Caleb whispered. The dog looked up, amber eyes steady in the fading light, and Caleb felt the quiet answer in that gaze. "No, we brought more than that." Outside, the flag moved gently against the evening sky. Somewhere down the kennel row, a young dog barked once, then settled. Caleb turned off the office lamp but left the window uncovered, letting the frame tag rest in the last gold of day. Some things are buried because people hope the world will forget them. But grace has a way of returning to the exact place truth was hidden. Sometimes it comes through a witness brave enough to speak. Sometimes through a Marine patient enough to listen. And sometimes it comes through a German shepherd who lowers his nose to the earth and refuses to walk away until every lost name is brought back into the light.